Well, thanks for inviting me to be here. If it's okay, maybe we'll start with a quick prayer since we're getting started with more learning after eating. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Well, my talk is a pretty simple one. It's basically entitled Annulments, What You Want to Know. And so I'm going to tell you some things that I think might be helpful to you. And then at the end, I am going to have some time for questions. You can ask me questions you might have. I've been working for the Tribunal for 7 years now. 6 years. 6 years now. And so here's the topics that I'm planning on talking about today. The first part of my talk is going to be about how the experience of seeking an annulment can be a healing experience. Once I talk about that, I'll be talking about when is a good time to start an annulment. When is a good time to start an annulment? From there, I'm going to go on to talk about the question of should someone date before they have an annulment. Then I'll talk about how you would get started with an annulment. And then I got some kind of facts and figures and, little topical issues, and after that it'll be time for your questions. So please ask lots of questions. I would really love it if you do that. So how can an annulment be a healing experience? How can going through an annulment, seeking one, petitioning for an annulment, be a healing experience? And for me, there's a big way, that's the main way it can be a healing experience, and then there's kind of a side benefit way, another way it can be a healing experience. To explain why I think the main way is the main way, I'm just going to take a moment to talk about what an annulment is, right? So an annulment, a decree of nullity, is where the church says that these two people who attempted marriage, who on their wedding day came together and exchanged vows, though they probably had goodwill, though they had every intention of this lasting forever, for something prevented the bond of marriage in the eyes of the God and the eyes of the church from forming between these two people. So that while with goodwill they may have lived out married life for a lot of years, as a matter of fact, at the present time, they're not held to each other by the bond of marriage. Because the consent they gave, something stopped it from having its natural effect of making the bond of marriage. So then the process of an annulment, right, is a process about trying to gain clarity about what God asks of someone in the future by coming to a deep understanding of what has happened in their past, right? It's about getting clarity about God's path for you for the future based on a clear understanding about what has happened in the past. So that to me brings up the main way that an annulment, that going through that process can be a healing experience. Because when we have clarity about what God asks of us, that is something that is good for our internal healing. In my life, confusion tends to be really corrosive to my spiritual life, right? When I don't understand what's going on, when I'm confused, that tends to mix me up in my head pretty fast. So the annulment experience can be a healing experience by helping people to get clarity. So they understand, how is God asking them to live? What is God asking them to do? And that to me, I think, really is the main thing about annulments, about the process for them. It's all about finding out the truth so that we can follow God's plan for us. Every single person in this room, really every single person in the world, right? No exceptions. God has a plan for their life. A way that from who they are right now, they can follow His paths, they can grow in holiness, they can have all their sins taken away, they can not just go to heaven someday, well that would be worth everything, right? But they can go to heaven looking back on their life and saying, Lord, you've been good to me. My life had a lot of surprises, had things I never thought would happen to them, but I can see you were with me the whole time, that you've always been with me, and I'm so grateful that I got to live this life with you. And now I'm going to heaven. So that's true for everybody. Whatever circumstances life throws at us, whatever comes to us, that's always true about who we are. And that's why as Christians, we never have to fear the truth. I mean, I'm telling you this because it's true, not because I always live it out perfectly, right? I mean, sometimes I'm kind of afraid to face the truth, you know? But if we really are paying attention, the truth is Jesus Christ. And if we come to understand the truth about who we are before God, then we can have clarity about what he asks of us, and somewhere in that, there's going to be peace, okay? So for me, that's the main way that seeking out an annulment can be a healing experience. It can give you clarity about what God asks of you for the future by coming to an understanding of what's happened in your past. So that's the big one. And before I move on, I want to say, at the tribunal, like people like me doing our work in that tribunal, that's what we're really focused on, right? We want to, as much as possible, as much as human beings can. None of us have a divining rod for detecting invalid marriages, right? None of us are infallible. There is someone in the church who's infallible, but no one in the tribunal has that gift. So as human beings, figuring out the best as we can, being careful, really trying to listen to people, trying to gather all the information we can. We want to come to understand the truth so that we can help people understand it too, and so they can have clarity and they can have peace about going forward, in whatever God asks them to do. That's what we're focused on. But in my experience of working in the tribunal, rather frequently I'll run into people who say that beyond that work, beyond that benefit, their experience of going through annulment was healing for them in another way. And this isn't like kind of what I'm focused on as I'm doing my job, although we try not to get in the way of it, right? But this is another way that the experience of going through annulment can be a healing experience. Some people find that that going through the process of petitioning for annulment can be a moment where they have a chance to reflect on their life in a deep way, right? And they get a chance to see the big picture, understand why people did what they did, go deeper in their own motivations, come to a deeper understanding. I probably don't have to tell any of you this, but life's really busy, right? I mean, it just keeps coming at you at full speed. And so as a result, even super important things that happen to in our life, even like really big things that happen, a lot of times you get hit by that, you put your head down, you keep pushing, you make life go, you keep the balls all moving, you keep everything in the air, and years go by without really life giving us much opportunity to reflect deeply on what's happened to us. And so I've read, and I've had people tell me that process of going through the annulment, the investigation, the questions, for them was that moment in their life where they were able to process all the stuff that had happened and come to a deeper understanding of it. And when that side bonus comes up, it can have a lot of wonderful effects in people's lives, right? Because sometimes it's an occasion to have a deeper compassion, right? A deeper compassion for themselves, where they realize that some of the things I experienced, now I understand where that was coming from in my life. Sometimes that can be a moment where people have a deeper compassion out of that for their former spouse, right? Where they say, you know what, having thought about all this, having to answer all these questions, I just have a better sense of who that person was as I was getting married to him and why this kind of went the way it went. That experience of having a deeper compassion, in turn, that can be something that can be healing in the sense of helping us get ready to forgive, to let go of what happened, to be able to move forward. Just to be honest, to be frank with you, everybody, it doesn't always go like that, right? Sometimes that experience of going through an annulment is only healing in the first way, right, where we give people more clarity. Sometimes people's experience is just kind of tough, and they don't get that bigger perspective. I mean, some people do a good job of reflecting on their lives, and maybe if you're one of them, you feel to yourself, I already thought this through pretty deeply, Spend a lot of time thinking about it. Fair enough. But for all that being said, I know that for many people, when they talk about their annulment experience being a healing experience, one of the reasons is because they had someone else listen to them in a deep way, and that experience of going through the process, having someone listen to them, pushing them to reflect, helped them to come to a deeper understanding of what had happened in their life, and so they had more peace afterwards too. Okay, so that kind of wraps up my first part about how I think annulments can be a healing experience. The next thing I'd like to talk about is when do you start the annulment? What's a good time to start your petition for a decree of nullity? And for me, the biggest part of this answer basically ties back to the main reason why we're doing annulments, right? Why we're doing hearing petitions for decrees of nullity. It goes back to that fundamental point that this is about gaining clarity about the future based on a deep understanding of the past. So what I would tell you is the main time to think maybe I'm going to go get an annulment is when, for whatever reason, you decide that that's something important to you, right? That for right now in my life, I want to have more clarity about what's in my future, what might be possible for me as a Catholic. Or right now, I want to get to a point where I have a deeper understanding of what happened in my past. So to me, when you get to that point where you want to understand better what God asks you to do in the future, or where you want to understand better what happened in your past, that's a good time to be starting a decree of nullity. Sometimes that happens because someone who had never thought they would ever get married again bumps into someone who really seems special, and they start to wonder, well, maybe I could be married again. And if that could be a good time to petition for a decree of nullity. Sometimes people pursue it still kind of intending that they would never particularly get married, but they just gotten into a point in their journey where they think this will be a healing experience for them, and they really want to understand what happened. So I've seen all kinds of people, for a lot of different reasons, petition for decrees of nullity. That's the big one for me, and now I'm going to go into some kind of little practical ones. And I basically just have two here. If this is something that you think you might want to do someday, if you think, well, I don't know, I could see maybe asking for a decree of nullity eventually, making a petition, then I would encourage you, sooner might be better than later. And the reason is because the whole process is about trying to understand what happened. And when those events get farther and farther removed in time, sometimes it can just be hard to remember what happened, right? Or hard to, be able to sort it all out and explain it well. For me, when I think of cases like that, the classic example would maybe be a case, and I've seen this kind of thing happen several times, which is why I'm bringing it up. Maybe someone, when they were young, they went away to serve in Vietnam, and things were a little unusual in the courtship already, and then they came back from Vietnam, and everything, the marriage that they had arranged happened really swiftly, and it all blew apart, And on its face, you kind of wonder as a judge, wow, I wonder if something happened to that person in their experience serving in Vietnam that was a part of this whole story and affected their ability to get married. So, you can see how there might be a case there if you're a judge. But sometimes, Vietnam, when was that, 40 years ago, more, we were pulling out? It's just hard to remember the details, right? And so those can be difficult cases just because it's so hard to remember what was things like, what are my memories from back in those years. All that basically just to say that if you think you might want to pursue a decree of nullity someday, petitioning sooner rather than later might be a positive because it might be a little easier for the tribunal to do their work. That being said, the other side of the question makes some sense to me too. Going through a divorce, wow, what a crazy tough experience that is, right? I mean, that's something that can beat you up on the inside the way a few things in life can. So it could make sense to me that someone would say, boy, I just had my divorce real recently, and I don't think I could take trying to talk this through and explain to someone all the things that went on. I'm going to wait a little while, let my emotions settle a little bit, let there be some healing before I try to petition for decree of nullity and seek that deeper understanding. And that would make sense to me because that human instinct where we put our head down and we push and we just keep going, that doesn't always serve us well, but sometimes that is good for us to just get some time between us and the event that happened that hurt so much. So anyhow, to summarize then, mostly what I'll have to say on when do you start your annulment, the most important thing, it's kind of when it becomes important to you to start, right? And then secondly, sooner might be better than later, just because it'll probably be easier to remember what had gone on during the marriage life. The last thing I want to say is I would suggest to you that it would be good, it would be right, it would be wise to receive an annulment before you started dating. And I'm going to go on to take that as kind of my next topic for this talk. As I enter into this part of the talk, I just want to acknowledge that, if you want to check anything I say here today with smart priests who love you a bunch, feel free to do that. I don't got a monopoly on understanding everything, but I'm just going to try to explain to you why, from my point of view, having an annulment before you start dating is something that makes sense as a Catholic. The other thing I want to acknowledge is that everybody, whatever your state in life is, whatever's going on in your life, everybody needs some friends in their life who are going to listen to them in a deep way, right? And everybody, I think my mic just is cutting out here, okay. And everybody, whatever your state in life is, you need some people who can share your life with you. And everybody, whatever your state in life is, you need some people you can hang out with and have fun, right? And regrettably, in our culture in the U.S. today, sometimes those things can be kind of hard to find, especially if you're a woman and you like to have some men in your life who are going to be good friends to you. Or if you're a man and you want to have some women in your life who are going to be friends to you. Sometimes those things can be kind of hard to find outside of the context of dating, because a lot of people just in our culture tend to parse male-female friendships inside dating, and outside of that, they don't totally understand them, right? That's true, and that's a hard deal. It's not one of the great things about our culture. So I just want to acknowledge that all the stuff I'm going to say about dating and what I think about it and why I think it's better to have the annulment first, none of this is meant to say that people who are divorced need an annulment before they have good friends of the opposite sex, right? Before they go to movies with people of the opposite sex, before they are hanging out together and having a good time and having people who are a part of their lives and they're part of the other person's lives and they're sharing life in a deep way. Because all of that stuff can be done inside a friendship. It can make sense inside a friendship, right? I'm going to leave it at that. Hopefully that was clear. If not, you guys can ask questions. Okay. So what I am going to go on to say then is I would suggest to you that dating is a kind of being with people and having fun, and a kind of developing friendships, and a kind of having people to support you and you support them that's different than just friendship in general, right? It's a special area of forming friendships, dating is. And I think that even culturally we have a pretty clear sense that what's distinctive about dating, as opposed to other kinds of just forming friendships and getting to be a deep, good friend to someone or having fun with people, is that dating has this connection to romance, right? If you think back to maybe two lovebirds in high school and they're both 16 years old, right? I mean, maybe in principle, the guy and the girl would say, it's pretty reasonable that my girlfriend or that my boyfriend is making a new friend who happens to be a guy or making a new friend who happens to be a girl. But if they found out the other person was dating someone, well, that would be a bit of a hiccup in the road for those lovebirds, because dating has this connection to romance, okay? And I think that even on a cultural level, I hope that a lot of people would agree with that. Then for Catholics, what's distinctive about us and what we've received from Jesus Christ, what we understand for him, is that kind of love that's romantic love, that kind of love that's so tied in with sexual attraction, that kind of stuff, that kind of love really is somehow connected to marriage, right? It can be hard to get into the details and explain it all, goodness knows, right? But we know as Catholic that dating, that romance, that experience of sexual attraction somehow is connected to marriage. And that then is why I would suggest that for Catholics it would be right to have an annulment before someone started dating, because dating just by its nature is all tied in with romance. I mean, and if I'm wrong about this, you can let me know, because I'm not an expert on dating, right? It's been a while since I did any of that. This is all tied into romance, and it just doesn't make a lot of sense. There's something a little out of whack, right? When someone is engaging in an activity that is just by its nature tied up with romance, and that person believes very strongly that romance itself has this connection to marriage, and the person doesn't really have clarity yet on whether they can be married in the church again, or whether they're held to that bond, of a prior marriage, even though the marriage has ended in divorce. So just to summarize, I would say that one of the challenges that can be pretty common for people who are divorced is that so many things about our culture are set up to handle friendship and socialization and having people support you and having deep relationships where people will listen to you. A lot of our culture is set up to handle those basically through dating, through marriage, through things like that, right? And as a result, it can be kind of hard to find ways to have those things that we all need outside of dating and marriage. But the challenge for us as Catholics, then, I would propose to you, is not only for people who are, divorced, but for a host of other people too. We want to learn how to have good friendships, deep socializing, have fun with people in a way that is open to everybody, regardless of whether they're, ready to head to marriage or not. Okay, so that kind of packs in my point about, dating and annulments. Next thing I want to go to is on how to start the process. So if you get to a point where you would like to pursue an annulment, to seek out a decree of nullity, what would be a good way to start that process? And the good news is that while there's a lot of bits and pieces to the process, getting started is super simple. Basically, getting started is about finding an advocate. An advocate is going to be a person who accompanies you, who helps you out, who helps you fill out the forms, who is there to support you if there's something hard, who's there to answer questions, who's there to interface with the tribunal if the tribunal is not communicating very well with you. That's the role of the advocate. The advocates that we have here in the Archdiocese of St. Louis, they all have some training from the tribunal, but most of them don't have like canon law degrees from a big university or something like that. It is easy to find an advocate because your parish priest, your parish deacon, either is an advocate or knows one, right? So if you would like to start that process of getting an annulment, basically all you got to do is make contact with your parish priest, make contact with your parish deacon, find out if they'll be your advocate or if they have some they want to refer you to. The next thing I want to talk about is if when you do go ahead and are seeking that annulment, when you start the petition, what are you looking for in an advocate? What would you hope to find in one? And for me, there's 4 things that you should be looking for in your advocate. Maybe ways to tell if you're going to have a good one or if you should look somewhere else. The 4 things are you want experience, and you want someone who's caring, and you want someone who has time for you, and you want to have someone who's organized. So experience and caring, and someone who has time for you, and someone who's organized. Surprisingly enough, I've listed those in reverse order of importance, right? So the least important thing is that you have someone who's experienced. Because whoever your advocate is, whether they're brand new out of the hopper or whether they've done this, since before I was born, right? Whoever your advocate is, they all got the tribunal there to work with them and support them, right? And so if the person is organized, and if the person can give you time, and if the person really cares about you, those things can take care of it if they don't have experience. But, experience does help. It means they have to call us a little bit less, and things maybe would go a little faster. The next one that to me is moving up from least important to most important, the next one would be someone who's caring. Admittedly, having someone who's caring is really important, right? You want someone who cares about you and who's kind to you as you go through the process. The reason I put this at number 3 instead of higher is everybody doing this work is just doing it because they care about people, right? We're not paying anyone big bucks. We're not paying anyone anything to be an advocate. So if they're doing it, it's because they either have a heart for people who have been divorced or they themselves have been through the process, and so I think you can almost take for granted that they're going to be someone who's caring. That being said, if you run into an advocate who doesn't seem caring at all, well, drop her or him like a hot potato, because you should have someone who cares about you. Then moving up the The second most important thing is to have an advocate who has time for you, right? Your advocate can help you in a ton of ways, but to do that, they're going to have to know you, and that means they're going to have to spend some time with you. And the tribunal process, goodness knows, it can take a while, right? And all that stuff starts to take a lot longer when closing that communication loop between like tribunal, your advocate, you, takes a month, because you can never get in to see your advocate sooner than a month, right? So that's why the second most important thing is for an advocate who really has time to help you. And then finally, the most important thing, I guess I would say, and maybe this is because I work at a desk all day filled with papers, and maybe I'm not like the smartest guy on this, but I would say it's someone who's organized, right? And the reason is because you want your advocate not to lose your paperwork, right? And you want your advocate to pay attention when the tribunal sends a letter and asks for something. And you want your advocate to be on top of things and kind of be thinking, we should have heard something by now. I wonder what's going on. Because an advocate who does those things, who has your paperwork in order, who is paying attention when the tribunal writes them something, who is on top of things and kind of being a little proactive about nudging the tribunal when a time limit should be coming up, that's someone who's going to make the process a lot less painful for you and is going to make it a lot more easier on you. And some advocates, who have very good will and who are willing to give people time, sometimes they just aren't the most organized people. And, it's the kind of thing where 75% of the time it all works out okay, right? And 25% of the time it gets a little bit messy. So, so that's for me is what you're looking for in an advocate. Most of all, organized, then someone who has time for you, then someone who's caring, and finally someone who has experience. The great news is you set up that first meeting with the advocate, whoever it is going to be, and that person will pretty much walk you through the whole rest of the process step by step. So what you're looking to do is basically just get that first meeting set up as soon as possible, and in that first meeting try to get a sense if that person is organized and has time for you and is caring and maybe has a little bit of experience. Everything else they're going to take care of, kind of walking you through it little by little. Let's see here. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to kind of quickly go through a couple of little random fun facts on annulments, and then after that I'm going to give you my main 3 things I wish people knew, and then after that we'll do questions, okay? If that sounds all right with everybody. So fun fact number 1, I just want to talk about some numbers for here in St. Louis. So if you go back about 20 years, the Archdiocese of St. Louis handled about 500 cases a year that were the formal cases, right? So we have a lot of different procedures we do depending on people's situations and what's going to work best. The formal cases are the big, long ones that take the most work. And 20 years ago, we had about 500 of those. Going back 10 years ago, we had about 300 of those. And going back in more recent times, we have maybe 200 or a little bit less a year. So the numbers have been going down over the last 20 years. If you go back 20 years ago, 88% of the people who applied for an annulment eventually got a yes, and about 12% of the people did not get an affirmative decision. In more recent times, like more recent years, we've had about 71% of the people get a yes, and probably about 29% of the people not get an affirmative decision. It would be difficult for me to figure out or to try to explain 100% of why that's happening, but to me the biggest reason for the change in the percent of affirmatives probably goes back to 2 things. 1, St. John Paul II, and 2, things changed slowly in the church, right? So back in the 80s and in the 90s, St. John Paul II was doing some very powerful teaching about taking care when we do annulments to not say that only saints can get married, that only extremely virtuous people can get married, paying attention to the fact that ordinary people with some problems can get validly married. And because of his exhortations and his work, the very large ship of the church started to turn very slowly to start paying more attention to the fact that also people who have some problems sometimes marry validly. And it just took a long time for his teaching back in the 80s and 90s to, like, start changing things down on the ground day to day. Okay, so that's all I got on the numbers, unless you guys will have questions later. Next thing I want to talk about real briefly is some recent changes. We know that Pope Francis has made some changes with the process for annulments. He did that in a document called Mitis Judex Dominus Jesus, which means the Lord Jesus, the meek judge. And the most important two changes were not the ones that got the most press, right? So the most important change is that he changed the procedure to cut out one of the major stages. That probably saves our petitioners here in St. Louis about 3 to 6 months in the processing of their case. The second important change he made was that he made it a lot easier to do processes across international borders. Before he made the changes, if you had someone who had gotten married in Mexico and the respondent was in Mexico, petition here in the United States for annulment, it could take us a big chunk of time just to even get started because of what we were required to do. But after Pope Francis, if you have someone who is from Vietnam petitioning here or someone from here petitioning in Vietnam, all that goes a lot faster now. The change that got the most press attention was the idea of the briefer process before the bishop, right? That there would be a special process used in very clear cases where the bishop with some advisors would rapidly gather all the needed information and give a decision, and it would go a lot faster than the normal process. That's what people talked about out of that document back in the day, and that is a real thing that can happen. The reason why I would not rate it as one of the most important changes is because that change was mainly advantageous for mission countries, and because here in the United States, the cases we see, most of them just aren't that easy to prove, right? I mean, 70% of them, right, even today, still get affirmatives, but like of that 70%, there's not a lot that are, snap your fingers, this is so super easy, bada bing, bada bang, we're done, right? And then there's some procedural things with the briefer process that make it, you can't always use it. It is a huge gift to the church, that briefer process for mission dioceses, because if you go to Africa or you go to other parts of the world where the church is still a mission territory, sometimes those parts of the world don't even have a functioning tribunal, right? So the option of being able to handle at least some cases just with the bishop and a few advisors is a really big deal if you don't have a functioning tribunal. But here in the United States, that part of the change that Pope Francis did just is not the most impactful, I would say. And then lastly, I guess I just want to talk a little bit about Amoris Laetitia. In chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis talks about the church's ministry to people who are divorced. That's a big, complicated issue that's gotten a lot of press attention. I guess what I just want to share with you is, to me, when I read over that document, Pope Francis is teaching in very close continuity with his predecessors, right? And so what I would say the main innovation about that is not like some radical departure from what we did before. I just don't think that that's what he's trying to say. I think the document bears that out. Instead, what I think the real innovation there is the idea that pastors of the church, when they are vigorous in teaching the truth about marriage, and everybody knows they can be relied upon to uphold the church's teaching on marriage, that those same pastors can then handle questions of scandal in a way besides just telling people, no, you can't do that. So, for example, there's been all the way back to John Paul II and before, there's the idea that some people who are divorced and remarried, if they choose to live as brother and sister, without sexual relations, and these are people without an annulment, right? Civilly married, not married in the church. If they are able to live in continence without sexual relations, then there can be sometimes a possibility of admitting them to Holy Communion. In the past, it was thought that to prevent scandal, they would basically have to do that mainly in places where people didn't know them in their situation. But I think Amoris Laetitia makes it possible to say, I can trust my pastor is a good priest, my pastor wouldn't be permitting these people to go to communion if he didn't know that in their specific situation it was morally right for them to do that. So people like that could maybe receive communion inside their own parish, rather than places where they're not known. All right, well, having said all that about Amoris Laetitia, I feel like I've opened up a can of worms without having too many fish hooks to fish with. But that also kind of brings me to the end of my talk, and I'm just going to give you my big things I hope you'll take away, and then I'll take your questions. Okay, so big thing number one, what's annulment all about? Annulment's all about getting clarity for your future based on a deep understanding of your past, as best as human beings can do it, figure it out. Point number two, I haven't talked about this yet, but it's always worth saying, there's a mistaken idea that if you have money, you can get an annulment, and it's just not true, right? Our tribunal here in St. Louis has said no to people who have a lot of money and who give a lot of money to the church, and we're all friendly people. We don't want to say no to people, but these people, they just had valid marriages, and you could tell when you heard their story. So it's just not true that money is a determinant in any way when you are seeking a decree of nullity. We have fees and all that kind of stuff, but all that stuff can be waived in case of financial hardship. None of our advocates are paid. So the idea that you're going to pay money and get an annulment, there's a few things in life that are total garbage, but that one is basically total garbage, I would say. Okay, and then the last thing I would just want to tell you is that I have my business cards in the back. Like a lot of things in life, if you need help, if you got questions, please come and ask somebody, right? So you can ask me if you don't know anybody else to ask. Okay, I think that's all I got for my talk, and now we'll take questions, okay? Okay, yeah, please.
If we're divorced and both of us want to go through the annulment process, like my ex-husband has decided he started the paperwork process. So will the Archdiocese then send me paperwork? He doesn't go through it by himself.
Great question. So the question was, suppose that two people have arrived at a divorce, and they both decide, both parties, the man and the woman, they want to seek the annulment. And in that case, when one party petitions, what happens with the other party? And the answer would be that when the Archdiocese receives his petition and all the accompanying paperwork that lets us get started, the Archdiocese will contact the other party. And we'll ask that person, here's what the person is saying they think is the reason the marriage was invalid. Do you agree with it? And do you want to give testimony? And do you want to have an advocate, right? So a person in your situation where both you and your former spouse agree that the marriage should be annulled, you're hoping it will be, when you get that first contact from the Archdiocese, you want to say, yes, I want to give testimony. Yes, I would like an advocate. Yes, I agree with the idea that this is invalid. And at that point, then they'll bring you into the process. Depending on the judge that you have, different judges handle their cases differently. They might send you a questionnaire like he filled out and ask you to fill out answers. Or it might be that the judge will have you come in for an interview. They'll ask a lot of the same questions, but they'll do it in an interview format rather than having you write everything out. Any follow-up questions to that or anything? Okay, yeah, great. Please.
Yes, and along with that question, what if one party wants to pursue the annulment?
Mm-hmm.
Go through that process where you ask the other
Mm-hmm.
party, and the other party doesn't want to cooperate?
Sure. So this is a very common question. What if only one party is hoping to seek an annulment and the other party just doesn't want to cooperate at all, right? So I'll give you the basic answer first, and then I'll expand on it. The basic answer is the tribunal will try to contact the uncooperative person, but they will eventually move on without that person's participation. And that was the basic answer. The more complicated answer is that, look, we really want to hear from both people if we can, because this is all about trying to understand the truth, and it just helps to listen to both people's stories, right? So we will contact them, and we would hope that they would participate. But at the end of the day, these annulments that we do, they're not about favors, right? They're about, doing justice, right? They're about telling people the truth because they have a right to understand it as best we can figure it out. And it would not be just, it would not be fair if one person, just because they're stubborn, or one person, just because they're grumpy, could say, I don't want to do it, so we're not going to do it. And that's why eventually the tribunal will move on without the participation of the other person, and they'll just do the best they can to learn what they can. So any follow-up to that? Or okay, great, thank you. Yes, please.
What if the grounds that you might seek divorce based on were not going to be obvious to any witnesses? What if there were,
Yeah.
if you were sexually active before you were
Yeah.
married and there was pressure or whatever,
Sure.
but nobody else knew
Yeah.
that? How do you, I know there are witnesses required.
Great. So this is another super reasonable question. The question was, suppose that the grounds for seeking the decree of nullity are based on facts that were not widely known. Maybe no witness knew about it. Maybe only one of the person knew, or the two people getting married knew. What about those cases? Even in those cases, we ask for witnesses, because while the witnesses might not know the key facts, sometimes they know circumstances that make those key facts more plausible, right? And they can, if nothing else, they can serve as character witnesses, people who can say, you know, this is the kind of person who would not lie to you about something serious. So we're always going to ask for witnesses. That being said, the church in annulment procedures does permit the statements of one person if there's nothing to call them into question, if there's nothing that makes the judge say, man, I don't know if this person's perspective can really be taken 100%. They really seem to have some strong bias. If nothing like that's present, if everything about the case says this person is speaking clearly about things they understand well, there's no question of bias, you can take people's statements as proven things in an annulment process. That was something that had been basically accepted even before Pope Francis in his recent documents. But one of the changes of the recent documents is that Pope Francis made that explicit. So he took that from being something kind of accepted and implicit, you know, as a practice, and he made it like explicitly stated, if everything checks out, you can take one person's word for stuff. Did that answer that question okay? Do you have any follow-ups?
One person being the petitioner or respondent? Or
It could be either, right? Yeah.
Okay.
So, for example, you know, it could be the petitioner saying, no one knew it except for me, but I had this horrific experience when I was a child. I told no one about it till I was, 50 years old, and that experience was affecting me, and here's how it affected me. So the tribunal could accept that if everything else checks out. Or it could be the respondent, right? It could be that you start the case, and the respondent comes forward and said, I just need to confess that I just never intended to be faithful. Even on the day of my wedding, I knew I was going to be breaking those promises. But I never talked with anyone about it. You can take his word or her word if everything checks out, if there's nothing that would call that into question. Any other follow-ups on that? Okay, yeah, great. Please.
Well, to follow up on hers and actually to tie it in, so my decree of nullity kind of went to, so my first spouse did not respond. There was like 2 times they contacted me. I think both by letter and even by phone call. There was that was it. However, my 2 witnesses were really good, my mom and my sister, and they weren't going to lie for me. So by that, they were able to see through them what they pretty much break me through the coals pretty good. But anyway, so they could see, these 2 are not. So I got good witnesses that were sound as well too.
And so this was just someone sharing a story that in their personal experience, when they applied for a decree of nullity, the respondent didn't participate at all. And indeed, as I said, the tribunal did try to contact that person twice. In this particular person's case, they were able to get a decree of nullity, and part of what helped so much is that they had 2 witnesses who were brutally honest, right, is the impression I got. They were family members, they sort of called it like they said it, and based on the good testimony of those witnesses, the tribunal got enough evidence to give an affirmative. So, okay, good. Any other questions? Please.
So, does the tribunal look at the grounds for divorce differently?
Let me ask a clarifying question. You said, does the tribunal look at the grounds for divorce differently? Can you tell me a little bit more what you mean?
File for divorce based on abandonment
Okay.
or based
Right.
on failure to,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yeah. The basic answer would be no, right? What happened inside the civil courts, right? The reason for which the civil courts gave a civil divorce, we read of what they said, right? We will read the divorce decree, but that does not enter very directly into our determinations about whether or not the marriage is valid or invalid. And the reason is because, goodness, the civil courts and us, we don't exactly see eye to eye on how marriage works and what's a good plan for it, Yeah, I think I'll just kind of leave it at that. The basic answer would be that the reasons for petitioning for the civil divorce are not usually like, there's no inherent connection between that and what goes on inside of our tribunal. Yeah, any follow-up questions or anything? Yeah, okay, yeah, good. Yes, please.
Just a comment on Deacon out of Jefferson City Diocese. Both my wife and I are advocates. In the legalistic society we live in today, if I'm working with a female, she's working with a male, we always ask them if we could have our spouse be a co-advocate, so that there's always a male and female present. So we go to their homes. So,
Okay.
our parish offices are too small to have an office
Right.
in there in that type of
Yeah.
situation. And the greatest thing is to maintain that confidentiality. So we don't even discuss with the priest. He knows who we're working with. Nothing else beyond that until the results are final. And by having my spouse as co-advocate, I have somebody I can discuss it with.
Yeah.
With another perspective of the case. It's very hard when you're the only one as an advocate trying to make that.
Yeah. Sure.
I'll find all the help.
So this was a deacon from Jefferson City who had a couple of comments they wanted to make. First one is he described a very praiseworthy practice where, kind of out of solicitude for the respondent and the fact that the parish rectory is not so big, they would go to people's homes to help them, meet in the home and fill out paperwork there. And then another very praiseworthy practice he described was how strictly they as advocates maintain their confidentiality with the people they're helping. They don't even discuss it with the priest at the parish. They keep that confidentiality very close. He mentioned that they like working, he and his spouse, as co-advocates. One, because it's just, kind of helps them feel more secure when they're visiting people in their home. And then also because it gives them an opportunity to work together to understand the best way to proceed with the case. And they both know that they're under that promise of confidentiality. They're not going to be violating the confidentiality. Okay, good. We got about 2 more minutes here. Does anybody else have questions before we finish up? All right, well, that being so, God bless you all, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. My card's in the back. Let me know if you need help.